Hi, I'm Mira. Welcome to another story. Let's see where this one takes us. The train rolled into Hemlock Vale just as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows over the small town. Alex Wren leaned against the window, watching as the jagged silhouette of the factory emerged from the haze. It loomed over the town like a sentinel, its dormant smokestacks framed by a faint, unnatural glow. They couldn't hear it from the train, but they knew what every article, rumour and anonymous email had described. The hum, faint but insistent, like the pulse of something alive. As the train shuddered to a stop, Alex grabbed their bag and stepped onto the cracked platform. The air smelled of soot and iron, tinged with something faintly metallic that made their skin prickle. A few townsfolk lingered nearby, their eyes darting toward the stranger before quickly looking away. "Tourist?" asked the station attendant, her voice as worn as the floorboards beneath Alex's boots. "Journalist," Alex replied, brushing past her and heading toward Main Street. Hemlock Vale was the kind of town where time seemed to have stopped, though not gracefully. Faded awnings and peeling paint adorned the storefronts, and the occasional horse-drawn cart mingled with rusting pickup trucks. But it was the people who stood out the most, quiet, reserved, and wary. Alex felt their eyes on them as they walked, the weight of curiosity mixed with distrust. The factory loomed in the distance, dominating the horizon. It didn't belong in a place like this. Its angular architecture and glowing veins of energy seemed more at home in a dystopian nightmare than in this rustic, forgotten town. Its presence was palpable, even from here, like a distant drumbeat just on the edge of hearing. Alex found a seat at the diner, pulling out their notebook as they waited for coffee. The waitress, a woman with crow's feet and a tired smile, hovered hesitantly. "You're new," she said, her voice low. "Just passing through," Alex replied. "I'm writing a piece about small-town traditions." Hemlock Vale came up. The waitress's smile faltered. "Then you've heard about the factory?" "Everyone has. It's why I'm here." The waitress glanced toward the window, her gaze lingering on the distant factory. "You should leave it alone. The factory's been part of this town longer than any of us. Asking questions won't change anything." "That's what everyone says," Alex said, leaning forward. "But people don't just hand over tributes without a reason. You can't expect me to believe no one knows what happens to them." The waitress straightened, her smile fading entirely. "Some things aren't meant to be known," she said sharply, before turning and disappearing into the kitchen. That evening, Alex stood near the forge, watching as sparks flew from Marla Kane's hammer. The blacksmith's broad shoulders and scarred hands gave her an imposing presence, but her sharp, observant eyes hinted at more than just brute strength. "You're the journalist," Marla said, not looking up from her work. Alex nodded, stepping closer. "And you're the one who knows the most about tributes." Marla's hammer paused mid-swing, and she looked up, her expression unreadable. "You've got a lot of nerve poking around here. Do yourself a favour and go home." "I'm not leaving," Alex said firmly. "Not until I understand what's going on here." Marla sighed, setting down her hammer. "You think you'll find some big hidden truth, but it's not like that. The factory takes the tributes. We don't know why, and we've learned not to ask. All we know is that when the tributes stop, the town suffers." "What kind of suffering?" Alex asked, their voice softer. Marla hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the anvil. "Crops die, accidents happen, people get sick. You think it's superstition, but it's not. The factory, it knows us. It knows what we need and what we fear." "Then why keep it a secret?" Alex pressed. "If the factory is that important, why not tell people what's really going on?" Marla's jaw tightened. "Because there's no point. What's inside that place isn't for us to understand. It's a balance. You break it, you pay the price." Alex stepped closer, their voice steady. "What if the price isn't worth it?" Marla's gaze locked onto Alex's, a flicker of doubt breaking through her stern expression. "That's not a question this town gets to ask." Later that night, Alex stood at the edge of town, staring up at the factory. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the air and settling into their bones. The gates stood closed, their intricate patterns glowing faintly in the moonlight. Behind them, Marla approached, her footsteps heavy but deliberate. "You're really going through with this, aren't you?" she asked. Alex nodded. If no one else will question it, I will. Marla sighed, her shoulders slumping. Then you're going to need someone who knows how to get you out alive. Alex turned to her, surprised. You're coming with me? Marla crossed her arms. Don't make me regret it. Together they stepped toward the factory, its hum growing louder with each step, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. The factory gates loomed before them, impossibly tall and intricate, their glowing patterns shifting as if alive. Alex Wren hesitated, their hand hovering inches from the cold metal. Beside them, Marla Kane crossed her arms, her expression hard as iron. The hum of the factory thrummed through the air, resonating in Alex's chest, like a heartbeat that wasn't their own. You're not going to find what you think in there, Marla said, her voice low and steady. Alex glanced at her. And what do I think I'll find? Marla didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the gate, her hand brushing over the glowing patterns. You think it's a mystery to solve, a puzzle with a clear answer. But the factory doesn't work like that. It's something else. Something else, Alex repeated, their voice skeptical. That's not exactly helpful. Marla turned, fixing them with a glare. I'm not here to hold your hand. You wanted to see it for yourself. So go ahead. But don't say I didn't warn you. With a deep breath, Alex pressed their palm against the gate. The patterns shifted beneath their touch, the glowing lines curling and twisting like veins pulsing with energy. The hum deepened, and the gate shuddered before swinging open with an almost reverent slowness. Beyond the gate was a corridor that defied explanation. The walls weren't made of metal or stone, but something organic, almost fleshy, glowing faintly with the same pulsing light. The air was thick, charged with an energy that made the hair on Alex's arms stand on end. This is wrong, Marla muttered, stepping in reluctantly. Her boots made no sound on the soft, pliant floor. It's different from before. You've been in here? Alex asked, their voice barely above a whisper. Once, Marla admitted, when I was a kid. My parents didn't want to leave a tribute one year. Said the factory didn't deserve our work. The overseers made us come here to apologise. Alex shot her a sharp look. Overseers? They're gone now, Marla said, her voice tight. Left years ago, but the factory stayed, and so did the rules. The corridor widened into a vast chamber, its walls alive with shifting patterns. In the centre stood an altar-like structure piled high with tributes. Sculptures, tools, carvings, and strange, delicate creations that looked like they had no purpose other than to exist. Each glowed faintly, their light feeding into the veins that ran through the walls and ceiling. This is where they go, Marla said, her voice heavy with reverence and unease. The tributes we make, they end up here. Alex stepped closer to the pile, their fingers brushing against a delicate metal carving. The moment they touched it, the hum of the factory surged and the veins along the walls flared with light. Don't! Marla hissed, grabbing Alex's arm. But it was too late. The chamber trembled and the altar shifted, revealing a heart-like structure beneath it, suspended by thick, glowing tendrils. It pulsed with a deep, rhythmic beat, each throb sending ripples of energy through the chamber. Alex stumbled back, their breath catching in their throat. What is that? They asked, their voice trembling. Marla didn't answer. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. The hum deepened into a resonant voice, not spoken but vibrating directly in their minds. You seek answers, you bring chaos, why have you come? Alex gritted their teeth, stepping forward despite the tremors beneath their feet. We want to know what you are, why you take the tributes, what you're doing to this town. The voice reverberated through the chamber, cold and unyielding. You ask what you already know. We sustain, we preserve. Without us, there is nothing. Preserve? Alex shouted. You mean control? You keep them dependent on you. The heart pulsed violently, the tendrils lashing out against the walls. Dependency is survival. Your kind cannot live without us. Marla's voice broke through the chaos. Alex, we need to go, now. But Alex shook their head, their gaze fixed on the pulsing heart. What happens if we stop? What happens if the tributes end? The voice faltered for the first time, its resonance shifting. Destruction, chaos. The balance will break. Or freedom, Alex countered, stepping closer to the heart. What if it's just fear keeping this town in line? The chamber trembled violently, and Marla grabbed Alex's arm. You don't understand what you're doing. If you destroy this thing... Then we find out the truth, Alex said, their voice firm. They reached out, their hand brushing against the heart's surface. The pulsing light flared blindingly, and the tendrils recoiled as if in pain. The chamber shook, and a deafening roar filled the air. "Alex, stop!" Marla screamed, but it was too late. The heart convulsed, its rhythm faltering, and the glowing veins along the walls began to darken. The hum ceased, leaving a deafening silence. The walls started to collapse, chunks of the organic material falling away to reveal the cold metallic framework beneath. Alex grabbed Marla's hand, pulling her toward the exit as the chamber disintegrated around them. They burst through the factory gates just as the entire structure collapsed inward, its glow extinguished. The hum was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost suffocating. The town's residents had gathered in the streets, their faces pale with fear as they stared at the crumbling factory. Marla turned to Alex, her chest heaving. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Alex looked back at the ruined factory, their expression a mix of determination and uncertainty. "We ended it, now we find out if the factory was right." The silence after the factory's collapse was deafening. Alex stood at the gates, their chest rising and falling as they struggled to catch their breath. The air was thick with dust and an eerie stillness, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Beside them, Marla stared at the ruins, her face pale and her hands clenched into fists. "You've done it now," Marla muttered, her voice trembling. "The factory, it wasn't just something, it kept us alive." Alex turned to her, their jaw tightening. "It kept you dependent. What kind of survival is that?" Marla's sharp laugh was devoid of humour. "The kind where we don't starve. The kind where accidents don't happen every other day. You don't understand. The factory wasn't just taking, it was giving." The townsfolk began to gather behind them, their expressions a mix of fear, anger, and confusion. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, each voice rising into a cacophony of uncertainty. "What's going to happen now?" one man asked, his voice shaking. "Is it over? Are we free?" Another whispered, though her tone carried no joy. "We're doomed," an older woman muttered, clutching a carved wooden object, a tribute she had likely spent hours creating. Marla turned to face the crowd, her voice rising above the noise. "Everyone, listen, we need to stay calm." "Stay calm?" the older woman snapped. "That factory was the only thing keeping this town together. What do we do now?" Alex stepped forward, raising their hands. "You rebuild. You figure out how to survive on your own." The crowd fell silent, but the tension in the air was palpable. Marla's glare could have cut steel. "Easy for you to say. You don't have to live here. You don't have to see what happens when everything falls apart." "Maybe you're stronger than you think," Alex shot back, their voice steady. "You've built your lives around this thing, but that doesn't mean it's the only way. You can choose something different now." Marla shook her head, her voice low and biting. "You don't get it. You just don't get it." The first signs of change came quickly. By the next morning, the air had shifted. The hum that had once been a constant presence was gone, leaving an unnatural stillness that pressed down on the town like a weight. The ground, which had always felt solid and steady, now seemed to tremble faintly, as though something deep beneath it was stirring. The crops in the fields began to wither, their leaves curling and turning brown. Livestock, once robust and healthy, grew restless and sickly. The townsfolk moved through the streets with hollow eyes, their fear growing with each passing hour. Marla found Alex sitting on the steps of the ruined forge, staring at the distant hills. She dropped a bundle of tools at their feet, her expression hard. "Fix this." Alex looked up at her, their exhaustion plain. "It's not something I can fix." "Then what was the point?" Marla demanded, her voice rising. "What was the point of destroying the factory if all it does is kill us faster?" Alex stood, their eyes meeting hers. "The point was to stop being afraid of it. The factory didn't own you, you let it. And maybe this is what happens when you stop. But at least it's your choice now." Marla's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed like she might say something more. But then she turned away, her shoulders slumping as the weight of the town's future bore down on her. Days turned into weeks and the town struggled. The crops continued to fail, and the hum of the factory was replaced by the howling wind that swept through the empty streets. The tributes that once adorned every corner were gone, their absence leaving the town bare and vulnerable. But not everything was lost. Marla gathered the townsfolk in the square one evening, her soot-streaked hands gripping the edges of a makeshift podium. "We've depended on the factory for too long," she said, her voice strong despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "It's gone now and we can't change that. But we still have each other. We still have our hands, our tools, and our will to survive." The crowd murmured uncertainly, but a few nodded, their expressions hardening with resolve. Alex stood at the edge of the square, watching. They had stayed longer than they intended, drawn by the guilt of what they'd done and the stubborn hope that the town might prove them right. Marla caught their eye, her gaze sharp but no longer filled with outright hostility. After the meeting, she approached, her arms crossed. "Don't think you're off the hook yet." "I wouldn't dream of it," Alex said, a faint smile tugging at their lips. Marla's expression softened just slightly. "You've caused a hell of a mess, but maybe you were right about one thing." "What's that?" She looked back toward the crowd, where townsfolk were already forming plans, their voices louder and more determined than before. "We're stronger than we think." The town began to rebuild, slowly but surely. New crops were planted, new tools forged. The hum of the factory was gone, but in its place was something quieter but no less powerful, the sound of a town reclaiming itself. Alex left a week later, their notebook filled with stories and their heart heavier than when they'd arrived. As the train pulled away, they glanced back at Hemlock Vale. The factory was gone, but the people remained, scraped raw but alive, and determined to face whatever came next. Thanks for listening. If the story stuck with you, come back next time for another journey.